Assalamu alaikum.
Good. Assalamu alaikum. He can't say alaikum. Alaikum, okay?
I can say it.
Assalamu alaikum. Good.
Alaikum.
Alها مش مر. عليكم.
Coming up in this episode.
With all due respect to David Cameron, I don't think he'll be the one picking up a Nobel Peace Prize for the Middle East anytime soon. What else would the United Nations have to talk about? What would the BBC have to cover all the time? How would Jeremy Corbyn spend his Saturday afternoons if he wasn't going on Free Palestine rallies? A journalist from the Financial Times told me off the record, and he's been to most luxury hotels in the Gulf. He said the best hotel he stayed at in the Middle East was in Gaza.
Shalom and welcome to Peace Talk, a podcast about Israel
and the Middle East.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti, a British Jewish journalist in London.
I am Moataz Khalil, Egyptian Muslim journalist based in London.
Joining us in this episode is Tom Gross, an expert in the Middle East and also media coverage of the region. Tom and I have actually been friends for many years, so I'm delighted he's joining us today and giving us the benefit of his insight and analysis into what's going on in Gaza at the moment, but also in the wider region and looking back and into the future to see how things might map out. So Tom, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Happy to be on your podcast.
First off, Tom, I thought I'd start by asking you generally if you might give us an idea from where you're sitting of what you think the world, especially people less interested, are missing about the situation at the moment. It's a unique situation for quite some decades, what's going on in the Middle East. And yet I think a lot of people are lacking some understanding in it, especially watching the Western media. You're an expert in how the media covers Israel and the Middle East.
Well, I'd say for sure the media is actually miscovering Israel and the Middle East and getting a lot of things wrong. But if I could just step back for a second, I think it's still a work in progress, October 7th. I think the Hamas massacre in southern Israel on October 7th, I think it has repercussions globally. And let's just widen it out for a second. Let's go to that famous or infamous testimony of the president of Harvard, MIT, and Penn in front of the US Congress. I think it was not just literally, it was about the treatment of Jews on campus or Israel and Gaza. But I think it's a wider thing. It opened a lot of eyes to the entirety of the state of global education at our elite universities. That's one thing. Another thing is the number of street protests we've seen globally in the last month since the October 7th pogrom. I'll concentrate on the West. We've seen major protests, pretty much every global city in Europe. But I think probably to surprise people in Britain and Europe is how many protests there have been in North America, in Los Angeles and New York and Toronto and so on. And some pretty aggressive protests where they've shut down Grand Central Station and Penn Station in Manhattan, and they've blocked bridges and freeways. And I think also going back to campuses, the sheer scale of protests across many campuses, it's not just in the past, it used to be Berkeley in California that had a reputation for radicalism. Today, it's everywhere. So I think these are moments not only for the Middle East, which I'll get to in a moment, these are also a crucial moment for the world, and particularly the Western world, in kind of domestic sociological issues, quite apart from anything to do with Israel and the Palestinians, in my view.
I think maybe what you're hinting at is something we discussed in the last episode, which is this idea of ideology. Ideology in the West has become sort of disposable. We don't really have ideology anymore among the man on the street or the man on the Clapham omnibus, as they say in the old days. And I wonder if that we're learning now in the West, a little bit too late, that they still have ideology in other parts of the world where there's also quite some risk and danger that they can pose to us. And that when there's a battle of ideology, if you don't really believe in your own, as we're seeing in those US campuses and elsewhere, you're starting really on the back foot. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, but I'll add to that. And I would say there is an ideology among particularly the left on American campuses. It's a kind of post-Marxist ideology that essentially wants to destroy Western civilization. I mean, that's quite a strong way of putting it, but they at least undermine it or change it. The whole concept of, ethnicity, what it means to be a man, to be white, it's all tied together, whether the men and women even exist anymore. It's the same people. It's Greta Thunberg, the climate activist who's now going on free Gaza marches. Things are moving. So in the West, we're talking about a left-wing post-Marxist ideology, which is motivated really by undermining our own societies. But I think what you're meant, and I agree with you, is that in the Middle East, there is still a very strong ideology of radical Islam. Just to remind people, Islam is 7 centuries younger than Christianity. And you will correct me on the exact dates, but it's about the 7th century after Jesus, after Christianity, Islam was founded. And of course, Christianity has been through a Reformation, an Enlightenment, and so on in the last 700 years, to remind people that 700 years ago in medieval Europe, there was the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. There were vicious battles between Catholics and Protestants, also some Orthodox Christians. There were beheadings and massacres and rapes and so on, a little bit like what we saw from Hamas in Israel on October 7th. So I think it's also about a struggle within the Middle East and within the Arab world, but also the larger Islamic world, between, let's call it, modernity and a kind of medieval, past, unreformed version of Islam. So this is also what's going on. So when look, no one likes the fact civilians are dying in Gaza or in Israel. And it's obviously tragic, and we can talk in a little bit about exactly why people are dying in Gaza and what can be done to stop that. But what I'd say is, behind that is something much wider between, let's call them the countries that maybe they do not have perfect human rights records, but they are trying to move away, the governments, from radical Islam. So Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, they have all kinds of internal problems and human rights problems, but what they're not is Islamist. They're not trying to push a radical version of Islam. And then on the other side, we have 2 countries, Iran, but I also want to add Turkey, where their governments are trying to push a more Islamic world.
And Qatar.
Sorry, Qatar.
And Qatar.
Yes, Qatar, absolutely. But the reason I also mentioned Turkey is Turkey's a NATO member. It's supposedly kind of part of Europe. Many Turks are secular and do not like the government. But the government of Erdogan is probably more radical and more Islamist than pretty much any Arab government other than Qatar at the moment. So we have with Iran both an Islamist Shia radicalism, which we see through its proxy militias it's supported or set up. Just to remind people, that's Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's the Houthis in Yemen, that's Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the West Bank. And then there are smaller Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, in Syria and elsewhere. So there's both a kind of Persian Iranian nationalism, but there's also a kind of Shia radical Islamism, which is almost as bad as the Islamic State's Sunni radical Islamism. The difference is the Islamic State, even though it's called a state, don't actually have a state. Iran very much does have a state, the radical Shia government in Iran. So there's a lot of concentration on Israel-Gaza, but it's really just one small part of a much, much bigger situation we're in, with all kinds of ramifications.
When I read your articles and also see your interviews, I think that your special war with ignorance about the Middle East. What they know is in the West about Israel and the Middle East is next to nothing. Okay, you sure that you will win?
Well, it's worse than that. They think they know things which are either completely wrong or so twisted as to virtually be wrong. So, yeah, if, for example, somebody asked me to deal with or to talk about, let's say, Kashmir, which is, the region between India and Pakistan that's disputed, I would say, I'm sorry, I don't know enough about Kashmir to say anything about it. I don't know who's right, India or Pakistan. The problem with Israel and the Palestinians is a lot of people seem to have opinions when they actually don't know anything about it. And everyone seems to want to have a say, and they know nothing.
But why do you think that is?
It's so important to point, but why? As a result of the money, or why?
It's a big question why. Look, part of it is the media covers it a lot. So it's a matter of great attention. Just the sheer quantity of news, it's hard to get away. If let's go back to Kashmir again. If the BBC, for example, sent dozens of reporters to Kashmir and filled up about 50% of all its news broadcasts on Kashmir, we'd probably all suddenly think we knew a lot about Kashmir, whether or not we did. So there is obviously an interest in Israel and the Palestinians. It's been with us a long time. There's also a lot of political interest. I mean, look at the visits to Israel. I'm presently in Tel Aviv. I've been here on and off since October 7. I follow in the media and the Prime Minister's mailing list to journalists the visits of foreign leaders. It's not just the Americans. I mean, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's been here 4 times. Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary, maybe twice. Biden came. Biden hardly goes anywhere abroad these days.
Also, some actors and also some specialists. Authors, yes.
Yes, but what I want to say is, beyond the Americans, the number of foreign leaders, almost every European head of state has been, almost every foreign secretary and defense secretary and others, even other ministers from Britain. Jonathan probably knows the details more than me, but Britain, as is the case these days, seems to switch around ministers even quicker than Israel does.
Even prime ministers.
So we had David Cameron, the more recent foreign minister. We had James Cleverly before they were both here. We've had not just current prime ministers, Rishi Sunak, we had former one, Boris Johnson, etc., etc.
I think you should just be grateful we didn't send you Liz Truss.
Liz Truss she may have come in and come out, no one would have noticed. I don't think anyone would have recognised her, I'm sorry.
With all these Western countries, UK, US, and others piling into Israel at this, darkest hour, as Bibi has called it, and it truly is. It does make you wonder who's going to be helpful in finding a way out of the darkest hour to, let's say, for another cliche, reaching for another one, sure, the brighter future. And we've seen David Cameron now writing this piece in Haaretz. We've also seen Blinken, as you said, visiting the region quite a lot. I think in this latest visit, just over the last few days, it seems that we can crystallize something of an American Blinken plan, where he appears to be, it's not clear yet, trying to negotiate some kind of Saudi normalization that was on the books just before October the 7th, perhaps in return for a total ceasefire, perhaps some kind of hostage exchange in return for maybe, dare I say it, all the Palestinian prisoners or something reaching for that. Effectively, what I'm asking here is, who's going to play a part? Is it the David Cameron, let's say, two-state solution and humanitarian crisis as much as possible approach? Or is it the Blinken realpolitik approach of pressure on both sides to do things they won't like? And what does it look like to win this war? Both sides will want to say they've won. Israel's aims don't seem totally achievable in the way they've been declared: total defeat of Hamas, total release of hostages, etc. So in your vision, watching all these influences coming in, who's going to be the leader of getting out of the problem, and what might it look like, let's say, in a best case scenario?
First of all, with all due respect to David Cameron, I don't think he'll be the one picking up a Nobel Peace Prize for the Middle East anytime soon, judging by his rather simplistic and partisan views, which are overly hostile towards Israel, especially compared with Rishi Sunak and other members of his own government, who seem more clear-eyed than Lord Cameron does, although to be fair to David Cameron, he's probably just reiterating standard Foreign Office positions. And we know that the British Foreign Office has got things wrong in the past, which is one reason we're in this mess in the Middle East and indeed in other parts of the world in the first place. But to try and answer your question, is Israel's goal achievable? What I think the Israeli government has the goal it set itself is not the total eradication of Hamas. That's not what they've said. They want to remove Hamas as the governing power or effective military force in Gaza. So I don't think anyone thinks that this can be done overnight. And I don't think anyone thinks that there won't still be Islamic radicals in Gaza. I think the realistic aim of Israel is to degrade Hamas's forces to such a level that at least in the immediate short term, Israel will not be occupying Gaza, but they may have to go in counter-terrorism raids, just like they unfortunately still have to go into one or two cities in the West Bank, like Jenin. Israel has to send in its own forces to apprehend or prevent planned terror attacks that Israeli intelligence has found out about, or indeed even the Palestinian Authority may have found out about those attacks and asked Israel to come and stop them happening. So I think there is a realistic expectation that Israel is going to have to continue raids into Gaza. But let me just get to a bigger question. This is what I would like to have to see. I'm not sure it will be able to. One of the problems, as Mustafa pointed out, is Qatar. In recent years, Qatar and Iran have essentially run Gaza through their proxy Hamas. And Qatar is promiscuous. It is in bed with everyone, including Islamists. What we want to see is a country that is a more stable, better Western ally, like the United Arab Emirates, or Saudi Arabia, or both together if they can cooperate, but there are some rivalries between those two governments. We would like to see them essentially help restore Gaza and be the kind of father figure of a government in Gaza, which maybe in the long term or medium term could hold elections and be democratic. But in the shorter term, you probably need a stabilizing period with someone like Mohammed Dahlan, the exiled Fatah Palestinian leader from Gaza. He's based in Dubai. Someone like that has a certain degree of support in Dubai. What we know about Dahlan is, he's a Palestinian nationalist, but he doesn't want to destroy Israel. He actually believes, or says he believes, in two states, unlike a lot of other supposed Palestinian leaders. And someone like that could be the governor of Gaza. He'd be funded with some maybe UAE or Saudi American money to both stabilize the situation and to rebuild Gaza. The population of Gaza is 2 million. That's not actually that much. If you think how much money, Saudi Arabia is spending now on football and the forthcoming World Cup, or you see what Qatar did for the previous World Cup just over a year ago, all these stadiums, they built a whole metro underground system. It's not that difficult or that expensive for 2 million people to build a city, a sort of a mini Dubai.
Never mind that. So did Hamas built a metro system in that time, so it is possible.
Well, not that kind of exactly, but not that kind. But what I'm saying is the problem has always been ideology. The problem has been Hamas. The problem has been Iran and Qatar. In fact, contrary to a lot of Western press reports about a siege in Gaza, Gaza has not been such a bad place to live in recent years. They have 5-star hotels. A journalist from the Financial Times told me off the record, and he's been to most luxury hotels in the Gulf. He said the best hotel he stayed at in the Middle East was in Gaza. Okay, so there are absolutely luxury hotels, restaurants, there are shopping malls, markets, and so on. There's no reason that Gaza couldn't be built like a kind of almost like a Gulf state, like a smaller version of Dubai, has beautiful Mediterranean beaches, could have a tourist industry, and so on. And B, I'm not saying they should live off charity money from the UAE. Among the Palestinians are many entrepreneurs, are many engineers and so on. They need the help, but they could get a perfectly good functioning economy.
Okay,
Yes.
Tom, I wanted to ask you about when I saw your picture in Wikipedia, you sit with Michael Nabil, Egyptian activist,
Yes.
which support peace. And also now you talk about the visits to some world leaders which came to Gaza and see what Hamas did. But there is no Muslim, there is no Arab till now visit this place. As a result of that, I am Moataz, Egyptian journalist, Muslim. I can write and I can support peace in UK. And also, Joe encouraged me, and there is support to peace, which I can do. As a result of that, in conclusion, you think that there is hope to the peace to encourage these samples like Michael and others?
And might I just add to that, I know that Mizo, one of the things that we've bonded over since he's been here is this shared outlook towards peace and coexistence. But I think the reason he can talk about that as an Egyptian journalist is because he's in London. I think what
I can't do it in Cairo at all.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a very, very important and good question, and also quite a complicated one. And I'm not sure anyone knows the exact answer. But I'm an optimist, and my overall feeling is that the trend within the Arab world is to accept Israel. And I say that in spite of the fact there are many people in Egypt and elsewhere who do not like Israel at all. And indeed, there are people who don't like Jews as well, just beyond Israel. And I'm aware of that. But, there are also people, unfortunately, in London and Paris and even in New York that don't like Israel or Jews. My overall feeling from having met many Arabs, both reformers, like we just mentioned, and also people from governments, my overall feeling in private is that there is an acceptance of Israel among most people. Whether they like it or not important. I mean, Israelis accept Saudi Arabia. It doesn't matter if they love the government of Saudi Arabia or everything about Saudi Arabia. It's a reality, it's there. So my overall feeling is that most people in the Middle East realize Israel is there, are quite fed up with the entire Palestinian issue. There are so many other issues in the Middle East. Would like it just to go away or be solved or whatever. They have to pay lip service, partly because Western journalists are sticking microphones in front of them all the time and asking them about the Palestinian issue. But I don't think many governments in the Middle East, even the Lebanese and Syrian governments, which are no friends of Israel, I think they're much more concerned about Iran. They're much more concerned about radical Shiism, and they're much more concerned about the remnants of the Islamic State, radical Sunnism. And if anything, they see Israel as kind of ally of modernity, whatever they say in public. So, for example, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he's made some critical remarks of Israel since October 7th, and he's kind of paying lip service. I don't think for one moment that he wants Hamas to still be in control of Gaza at the end of this conflict. That's not to say he's some kind of Democrat and doesn't want to continue being a dictator, just to be clear. I'm for democracy, and that should come, but maybe later. With Egypt, obviously you know much more than me. I suspect that President Sisi, he kind of uses the Israel issue. He allows a certain amount of criticism in the media so people can let out hot air, where what they really are is probably want to change in the government in Egypt. But he lets them blow off steam with it. And yes, there are people who genuinely hate Israel in the Middle East. But my overall sense...
Al-Azhar situation. Al-Azhar support Hamas from the first day.
Yeah. But there's something else I want to say, which is a little bit, I may be wrong, but my overall situation is most Middle Easterners I've ever met, including the ones who very much are angry with Israel and sympathize with the Palestinians, they're not anti-Semitic. They don't bear any particular grudge against Jews, whatever they might say, or whatever certain media might say. I have always felt, I've noticed more anti-Semitism, even if it's disguised, very polite language between certain Western journalists I've come across, or even some Western diplomats.
I don't want to speak for you, but do you want to push back a bit on that? Because what I've heard from Moataz over time about his upbringing in Egypt, for example, and let's not forget, Moataz grew up in Suez. He is of the era of peace between Israel and Egypt, and yet, okay, but exactly. And I think that's the point, is what I've heard from you about how you were taught from childhood to think about Jews and Israel as totally incompatible with the optimism that, of course, we share with you for how things might be in the future. So,
by the way, if I talk till now with my friends in Egypt, by the way, they tell me when we disagree with Moataz, don't be Jewish. They tell me that till now, okay?
Okay, and you're right. And okay, so let me put it like this. I think there's more sympathy towards Israel, possibly in the Gulf, than there is in Egypt and Syria and Lebanon. And I also know Syrians who live in Europe who were brought up hating Jews and thinking they were devils. And when they finally met Jews, when they moved to Germany in one case, France another, they were like, wow, we didn't realize you're normal people. And they completely changed their attitudes. So, of course, I do not want to underestimate the level of the problem, the incitement against Jews in education and media. It's a huge problem. I guess what I'm saying is, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I guess what I'm saying is a lot of this comes from state media and educational policy, and it's quite possible, as I think we're seeing in Saudi Arabia, to shift the education system and shift the some of the sermons given in mosques and so on to change people's attitudes. And what I'm really saying is, I think it's easier to change because anti-Semitism has less deep roots or less vicious roots in Muslim world than it does in the post-Christian world. Unfortunately, I think anti-Semitism in the post-Christian world, of course not among everybody, but among too many people, even if they're secular, even if they are themselves atheistic, it stems from Christian origins, is very, very deep. Whereas at least with people such as yourself and other Muslims and Arabs I know, once they have got over their education, they're very friendly to Jews and they're fine. I don't feel any animosity at all. Whereas I can't always say that, unfortunately, about even people I grew up with in London who went to school with me.
I think that's really interesting, by the way, because you and I both grew up in London and went to quite establishment British schools and university. We didn't grow up, let's say, in a Jewish bubble, as maybe some do. And I think that I, like you, witnessed really a low level but persistent, pernicious level of just, well, let's call it otherness for the sake of being charitable, not necessarily anti-Semitism overtly, but it was there, and we've talked about it before. I wonder what you think then to things like the protests that I know that Mizo's been to loads of them to observe them here in the UK. These protests have a really toxic and potent mixture of
many sectors.
Exactly.
NHS, city, charts, many
exactly.
sectors.
We see like NHS against Israel, effectively. We see teachers, we see university lecturers, we see white people, non-white people, Muslims, Christians, the left wing, all sorts of people on the streets together. Let's not beat about the bush. Massive numbers. And what about that undercurrent, or is it an overcurrent of anti-Semitism, say in British society? Is that what we're witnessing? And then, from the sounds of it, you're more worried about that than you are in the longer term about the Middle East levels of anti-Semitism.
Okay, so yeah, okay, let me just start with the Middle East. I don't want to downplay or be overly optimistic. What I'd say is the trend in the Middle East, at least in the Gulf, is moving, in spite of right now protests over Gaza, the trend is moving in the right direction. It's moving maybe not fast enough to incorporate Israel. I don't think, to go back to your previous question about whether Saudi normalization would be part of some kind of ceasefire deal to end the Gaza war, maybe so, but I think there's anyway a trend there that I've noticed for years. I've been saying for years that, I went to Qatar even in Doha Forum in 2012. I've been to Iraq, I've been to many countries. I've noticed the trend was to incorporate Israel slowly, but it was going in the right direction in Europe and North America and Australia and elsewhere, South Africa. The trend, unfortunately, is going the other way, in the sense that as the Holocaust in particular fades in memory into history, people, we see in recent days with the accusations in the international court that Israel is committing genocide, which is, of course, preposterous and absurd. But one of the things we see is the way in which, Europe in particular is saying, well, we don't have to feel guilty about the Holocaust anymore because let's water down what the Holocaust was and pretend it wasn't nearly as bad as it was. And at the same time, let's completely, wildly exaggerate what's happening in Gaza, which is in fact a war, it's not a genocide. And let's somehow equalize them so we can somehow, get over history and change the victim into the perpetrator, whatever. So my worry is that in that enlightened Europe and North America, clever, enlightened people in top universities or the NHS doctors or media or so on, some of the people protesting they've got the same attitudes that people might have had in York in the 12th century when they had a pogrom against Jews and expelled them from England. I mean, it's almost some years ago.
You see what happened last Thursday and the last Friday about South Africa and the court, and how do you explain the situation there, and how Johannesburg do all of that?
Well, I think South Africa is also trying to deflect from many internal problems they have. What I meant by this being a political football is it's very useful for other governments around the world to distract from domestic issues. As you mentioned, your own government in Egypt will stir things up against Israel instead of dealing with the multiple economic and other problems they have. South Africa, I don't know enough detail about South Africa, but it's being used as an issue. A lot of these campus protests in America and elsewhere are not really about Gaza. They don't even know where Gaza is, okay? They are protesting against the powers that be in the United States. Some of them are protesting against capitalism itself or against Western power structures. And they're trying to undermine them in every way. If they can do so by picking up on pronouns and trying to rewrite gender identities, or they can pick the issue of climate change, but none of us really understand it. We're not climate professors and scientists, but they will use climate change as an issue to then say, ban oil, ban this, ban transport, ban airplane travel, do this, do that. So likewise on Palestine, they will use this issue to make attacks. We see it in Britain in the British Labour Party. The previous leader, Corbyn, was so anti-Israel, and the current leader, who may well be the Prime Minister within a few months, the Labour leader in Britain, Keir Starmer, yes, he's sympathetic to Israel, but he's had to spend a lot of time on the subject of Israel to push back against the radical Corbyn left within the Labour Party, who, yes, they hate Israel and some of them are anti-Semitic. It is also just a tool for them to try and undermine Britain, to try and undermine the capitalism and power structures. So I think sometimes we Middle East experts should also realize that our field is being used in all kinds of ways globally to play out all kinds of other issues. And sometimes you also have to bring in psychologists to understand what's really going on here.
Can I ask you then on that? Yeah. On that, I saw you say something quite important on I24 News in an interview you did, where you mentioned the idea of refugees and that how this was just one area in which you saw the conflict at the moment in Gaza being massively different on the international stage. So within days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, places like the UK were putting in place ways to absorb a flood, let's say, a large number of Ukrainian refugees. And similarly, with other conflicts around the world, that's the case. And yet with Gaza, the very opposite happened. Nobody wanted to take a single Palestinian refugee, not Western countries, not Arab countries, nobody. They were locked in. So again, why? Why is there this, if it's a political football, why is it so different when it comes to Israel? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it anti-Palestinianism? What about it is different?
Well, just to correct you slightly, the point I was making about Ukraine war, for example, is not quite the same as Britain taking Ukrainians. My point was that in most conflicts, civilians are allowed to get out of harm's way. So in Syria, for example, 4 million Syrians went over the border to Turkey, 2 million went south to Jordan, 1 million went to Lebanon. Okay, I'm not talking about the ones who settled in a more longer term way in Germany, for example, or Ukrainians who may have settled in a more longer term way in Britain. I'm making a more immediate point that during a war, the two parties fight it out and civilians are allowed to get out of the way. What's happened in the current Gaza war is the Palestinian civilians have not been allowed to leave the combat zone, and it therefore becomes inevitable that some of them will die, however much Israel tries, and it tries more than any other army on earth to avoid civilian casualties, injuries, or deaths. It becomes inevitable. So my point is that on the immediate deaths in Gaza, which I should add are not as high as Hamas and the world media claim, but nevertheless they're unfortunately high. Those deaths could have been avoided if a temporary refugee center had been established just over the border in Sinai. Qatar alone could have built within days. We see how quickly they built stadium and hotels and infrastructure for the World Cup. They could have built a perfectly acceptable living conditions for a few weeks or months. And meantime, Israel and Hamas would fight it out. And afterwards, those Palestinians could return to Gaza. And indeed, the war would be much quicker. One of the reasons this war is going to be prolonged is it's impossible for Israel to fight it out with Hamas when it's trying to avoid killing any civilians, while Hamas are embedding themselves and hiding themselves in schools. The world has Palestinian blood on their hands. If civilians are dying in Gaza, it's also because the world will not let those civilians get out of harm's way. It's not only Hamas, of course it's primarily Hamas, but it's others. But I also want to say something else before answering why haven't they, which is the overall refugee question. Why are there still Palestinian refugees? By the definition of refugee applied to Palestinian, i.e. 4 or 5 generations ago, I suspect at least 50%, probably 60, 70, 80% of the world's population will be classified as a refugee. Anybody who has a great-great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandmother who had to move for economic or military reasons, that's pretty much the entire population of Asia and Europe and Africa. Okay, so the world has given a different definition to refugee to prolong this refugee problem, and they've also called refugee camps places in the West Bank or Gaza, which are basically towns. I remember a Japanese journalist I was with in the West Bank. He's covered conflicts around the world. And he said, oh, this is the only refugee camp I've been to where the refugees drive Mercedes. In other words, some Palestinian refugees include people like Queen Rania of Jordan is listed by UNRWA as a refugee. And now just to conclude, to answer your point, it serves political or other purposes of many, many different peoples in the world, different organizations, the United Nations, human rights groups, certain governments, to prolong this conflict. They can pretend till the cows come home, that they want a two-state solution, that they want this conflict to end. But they have prolonged it. The so-called peace process industry. This conflict could have been solved at least at the same time that India and Pakistan fixed a border, or Poland and Ukraine fixed a border, or the Czech Republic and Germany, or Poland and Germany, or France and Germany over Alsace-Lorraine. There is nothing very unique about this conflict that started in the late 1940s with border adjustments and population movements. This happens all the time. The reason this is kept going is because Israel is not allowed to win, and the world almost wants to keep it going for whatever motives. There may be some who are doing so because of anti-Semitism, because they don't like Jews, because they want Israel to be in a difficult position. But I think lots of people, it just serves a political use. What else would the United Nations have to talk about? What would the BBC have to cover all the time? How would Jeremy Corbyn spend his Saturday afternoons if he wasn't going on Free Palestine rallies? So, it serves a lot of interest, but let's not pretend that this conflict is somehow unique or can't be resolved. Of course it can. It's not Israel, and in a way it's not even the Palestinians that are keeping it going. It's all kinds of other bodies that are keeping it going.
From one refugee by UNRWA's definition to another, thank you for taking the time to explain things so carefully and in more detail, because I agree with you that what people need is more education, more long-form thought and discussion about this.
Thank you, Tom, and Toda Rabbah.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on with both of you.
Thanks very much for joining us in this episode. Stay with us for future episodes, and hopefully more talk will lead to more peace.
Shalom.
Assalamu alaikum.